The university's music appreciation class was always a mix of actual musicians and students who just needed the easy art credit. May found herself somewhere in the middle, though nobody would have known it. She sat in the back corner of the classroom, her dark hair often falling forward to hide her face when Professor Reynolds asked questions. Not that he asked her much anymore. After a semester of one-word answers or simple nods, he'd learned to let her be. May preferred it that way. The less attention on her, the better. She took meticulous notes, aced every written assignment, but participated just enough to maintain her grade. Her classmates barely registered her presence. She was just the quiet girl with the oversized sweaters and worn-out backpack covered in faded pins from orchestras around the world, souvenirs from a life they knew nothing about. It was the second to last week of spring semester when Professor Reynolds mentioned the end-of-year gathering at his house. Nothing formal, he explained, hands waving excitedly as they always did when he spoke. Just a little celebration before you all graduate and forget everything I taught you. The class laughed except for May, who just smiled faintly. I expect you all to come, Reynolds continued. My wife makes legendary appetizers, and there's a rumor I might break out the good scotch. Another round of chuckles. More importantly, my home has excellent acoustics, and there's a gorgeous grand piano that's begging to be played. I'm hoping to discover some hidden talents among you. His eyes swept across the room and, for just a moment, lingered on May. She quickly looked down at her notebook, tracing the edge with her finger. Doubt you'll find any in here. Professor? Called out a voice from the front row. The voice belonged to Rich Taylor, the kind of student who seemed to own any room he entered. Tall with an easy smile and the confident posture of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. Rich was well liked despite, or perhaps because of, his tendency to turn everything into a joke. You never know. Mr. Taylor, Reynolds replied with a knowing smile. Sometimes the greatest talents are the ones least advertised. May sank lower in her chair. The night of the gathering arrived warm and clear, with the kind of gentle spring breeze that carried the scent of nearby flowering trees. Professor Reynolds' home was an old Victorian on the edge of campus, its wraparound porch dotted with comfortable chairs and string lights that glowed like fireflies in the dusk. May almost didn't come. She'd stood in her small apartment staring at her reflection, talking herself into and out of attending at least 3 times. In the end, she'd promised Professor Reynolds she would make an appearance, and May didn't break promises. She chose a simple dark blue dress, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Her grandfather had always told her that true talent didn't need decoration. By the time she arrived, the party was in full swing. Clusters of her classmates filled the spacious living room, spilling out onto the porch, drinks in hand, laughter carrying through open windows. Professor Reynolds spotted her hovering near the entrance and immediately came over, his face brightening. May, you came, he exclaimed, guiding her inside with a gentle hand on her shoulder. Come in, come in. There's food in the dining room and drinks in the kitchen. Make yourself at home, she nodded, offering a small smile. Thank you for inviting me. Of course. It wouldn't be a proper send-off without my full class, even the quiet ones. He winked and May felt her cheeks warm slightly. As Reynolds was called away by his wife, May drifted toward the edge of the room, finding a spot near a bookshelf where she could observe without being observed. She recognized most of her classmates, the trombone player who always asked technical questions, the theater major who related everything to Broadway, the business student who complained about having to take an arts course but secretly enjoyed it. And then there was Rich, holding court in the center of the room, his boisterous laugh rising above the general chatter. He was surrounded by his usual group, fellow baseball team members and a rotating cast of admirers. May had spent 4 years in various classes with Rich without ever having a real conversation. They existed in completely different orbits. For nearly an hour, May managed to remain virtually invisible, making small talk with a few classmates who seemed surprised to discover she could string together complete sentences. She was considering making her exit when Professor Reynolds stepped into the center of the room and gently tapped a glass for attention. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, he began, looking genuinely happy to see his students in a social setting. It's been a privilege teaching such a diverse and interesting group. Before you all scatter to the winds, I hoped we might have a little music. He gestured toward the corner of the room where a gleaming grand piano sat, its lid raised invitingly. Any volunteers? Reynolds asked, eyes twinkling. Don't all jump at once. There was a moment of awkward silence, a few nervous laughs. Someone called out, "Show us how it's done, Professor." Reynolds chuckled. "Oh no, I wouldn't subject you to that. My talents lie in appreciation, not performance." His gaze swept the room again. Surely among 30 music appreciation students someone must play. Rich, who had been whispering something to his friend, suddenly straightened up with the look of someone who just had a brilliant idea. Or a terrible one. His eyes landed on May, standing half hidden beside the bookshelf. A slow smile spread across his face. "What about you?" he called out, pointing directly at her. The quiet one. "May, right?" All heads turned toward her. May felt her body go rigid as the room's attention focused suddenly completely on her. "I bet you play," Rich continued, his voice carrying an edge of challenge. "Professor's always talking about hidden talents. Let's see yours." Professor Reynolds frowned slightly. "Now, Mr. Taylor, no pressure." "It's not pressure," Rich insisted, though his smile suggested otherwise. "Just a friendly invitation. Unless there's a reason she's always so quiet. Maybe nothing to share?" There was something in his tone that made it clear. This was meant to embarrass her. A joke at the expense of the class nobody. A way to liven up the party by watching the awkward girl fumble through chopsticks or freeze completely. May felt her heart racing, her palms suddenly damp. She could feel the weight of every stare, the mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. Some looked uncomfortable with Rich's obvious targeting, but no one spoke up. "Come on," Rich pressed, gesturing grandly toward the piano. "Show us what you've got. Or don't you play at all?" The room had gone uncomfortably quiet. May could slip out now, make some excuse and avoid the whole situation. It would be easier, safer. What did she care what these people thought? In 2 weeks, she'd never see most of them again. But something in Rich's smirking confidence triggered a memory. Her grandfather's voice. Calm and steady. "There will always be people who underestimate you, May. Let them. Their surprise is your advantage." Slowly, May stepped forward from her corner. The small movement sent a ripple of surprised murmurs through the gathered students. Rich's eyebrows shot up, clearly not expecting her to accept his challenge. "I'll play something," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. As she crossed the room, the crowd parted like water. She could hear the whispers, feel the curious stares. Rich leaned against the wall, arms crossed, that same smug smile in place, waiting for the entertainment he'd engineered. Professor Reynolds moved toward her, concern evident in his expression. "May, you don't have to—" "It's okay," she interrupted gently. "I'd like to." The piano bench felt cool beneath her as she sat, adjusting her position with the automatic movements of someone who had done this countless times before. She let her fingers hover above the keys, not yet touching. The room had gone completely silent now, the tension almost tangible. Rich whispered something to his friend, who snickered. May heard it as she was meant to. She closed her eyes briefly, shutting them all out. The stares, the expectations, the setup for failure. In that moment of darkness, she wasn't in Professor Reynolds' living room anymore. She was in her grandfather's small apartment, the old upright piano against the wall, his patient voice guiding her through difficult passages. "Music isn't just in your fingers, May," he would say. "It must come from somewhere deeper." She opened her eyes, placed her hands on the keys, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne Opera 9 No. 2 filled the room, delicate but confident. The familiar melody flowed from her fingers as naturally as breathing. She didn't need sheet music. This piece lived in her heart, in her muscle memory, and the countless hours she'd spent perfecting every nuance of its emotional journey. Behind her, someone gasped. From the corner of her eye, she saw Rich's smug expression falter, confusion replacing amusement. Professor Reynolds stood perfectly still, his eyes wide with astonishment. But May was already sliding away from them all, disappearing into the music, letting it carry her as it always had. This was her real voice, the one that never stumbled or hesitated, the one that could speak volumes without a single word. The joke had backfired, and no one in the room was laughing anymore. The room fell completely silent except for the flowing notes of Chopin. May's fingers danced across the keys with the confidence of someone who had played this piece 1,000 times before. The delicate melody filled every corner of Professor Reynolds' living room, wrapping around the stunned audience like an embrace. Rich stood frozen against the wall, his smug smile long gone. His friends exchanged glances, shifting uncomfortably as the joke they'd been part of transformed before their eyes into something entirely different. This wasn't the awkward fumbling they'd expected. This was mastery. Professor Reynolds slowly lowered himself into a nearby chair, eyes wide with wonder. He'd suspected May had musical training. There were little tells in the way she discussed certain compositions in her written assignments, but nothing had prepared him for this level of skill. As a music professor for over 20 years, he recognized true talent when he heard it, and this was something special. As May finished the Chopin piece, there was a moment of breathless silence before the room erupted in applause. She looked up, momentarily startled by the reaction, as if she'd forgotten anyone was listening. A flush of color touched her cheeks. "That was extraordinary, May," Professor Reynolds said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "Absolutely extraordinary. Why didn't you ever say anything?" May shrugged slightly, her hands now resting quietly in her lap. "You never asked," she said simply. A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. Rich pushed himself away from the wall, trying to recover his composure. "Lucky guess on my part," he said, forcing a laugh. "I must have psychic powers or something." No one paid him any attention. All eyes remained on May. "Would you play something else?" asked a girl from class. Lynn, who always brought coffee for everyone during early morning sessions. "Please?" May hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys again. For so long, she'd kept this part of herself private. Playing publicly meant being seen, being noticed. It meant questions she didn't always want to answer. But there was something freeing about sitting at this piano, surrounded by people who had no expectations, who had just moments ago underestimated her completely. Here she could simply be the music. She nodded and placed her hands on the keys again. But instead of another classical piece, she began to play something different, something original. The melody started softly, almost hesitantly, like the first raindrops of a storm, before building into something more complex and emotional. This was the piece she had been working on for months, the one inspired by her grandfather. She'd never played it for anyone. It wasn't finished, wasn't perfect. But somehow in this moment, it felt right to share it. As she played, memories washed over her. Her grandfather's small apartment above the noodle shop, the upright piano he'd saved for years to buy, his hands weathered and strong from decades of work, guiding her smaller ones over the keys. "Music is the language we use when words are not enough," he would tell her. And he'd been right. May had been only 12 when they left Shanghai for America. Her grandfather had insisted on bringing her despite the cost, despite the difficulty. "She has a gift," he'd told her parents. "It must be nurtured." In America, he'd worked 2 jobs so she could have lessons with a proper teacher. Every sacrifice made with unwavering belief in her talent. She'd practiced every day after school, determined not to let him down. When she won her first competition at 14, she'd never seen him smile so wide. All of these memories, these feelings, loss, love, gratitude, determination, flowed through her fingers into the music. She wasn't playing for the room anymore. She was playing for him, the man who had given up so much so she could have this gift. Her grandfather had passed away during her sophomore year of college. The heart attack came suddenly one evening as he was closing up the small convenience store where he worked. She'd gotten the call during a practice session at the university music hall. For months afterward, she couldn't bring herself to touch a piano. The silence had been deafening. When she finally returned to music, it was different. More personal, more painful, more necessary. She'd withdrawn from the performance track, switched to music appreciation, a decision that baffled her professors. But she wasn't ready to play for audiences, to turn the raw emotion of her grief into entertainment. Until now, it seemed, as the piece reached its emotional peak, May was only distantly aware of the tears streaming down her face. She wasn't embarrassed by them. They were part of the music, as essential as the notes themselves. What she didn't see was the effect her playing was having on everyone else in the room. Professor Reynolds sat with his eyes closed, one hand pressed against his mouth. Several students were openly crying. Even those who knew little about classical music could feel the emotional weight of what they were hearing. And Rich, confident, never serious Rich, stood completely still, his expression stripped of any pretense. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that none of his friends had ever seen before, a rawness that seemed entirely at odds with his carefully maintained image. The music began to soften, the storm passing, giving way to something gentler but no less powerful. May's final notes hung in the air like a question without an answer, fragile and beautiful. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence that followed felt sacred. No one moved. No one spoke. For several heartbeats, the entire room remained suspended in the emotional space she had created. Then, slowly, people began to stir. A few wiped at their eyes. Others exchanged glances of shared amazement. Professor Reynolds cleared his throat several times before he could speak. "May," he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. I don't have the words. Was that your own composition?" She nodded, suddenly shy again now that the music had stopped. "It's not finished yet." "It's beautiful," he said simply. "Truly beautiful." Others began to murmur their agreement, moving toward her with expressions of wonder and newfound respect. Questions tumbled out. How long had she been playing? Where had she studied? Why had she never mentioned her talent? May answered softly, briefly, her usual reserve returning now that she was being asked to use words instead of music. Yes, she'd been playing since she was 4. Yes, she'd studied at the Shanghai Conservatory before coming to America. No, she didn't perform anymore. Just for herself, mostly. As the crowd around her grew, Rich slipped away, moving through the French doors onto the back porch. The cool night air hit his face like a physical relief. He leaned against the railing, taking deep breaths, trying to understand his own reaction. Why had her music affected him so deeply? Why did he suddenly feel so hollow, so ashamed? Behind him, he could hear the party continuing. Someone had put on a playlist and conversation had resumed, though May's performance remained the main topic of discussion. But Rich couldn't go back inside yet. Not until he got himself under control. The truth was, her music had touched something in him he'd been working very hard to ignore. The raw emotion, the honesty of it, it had cut right through all his carefully constructed defenses. For the first time in over a year, he'd actually felt something real. Since his father's death, Rich had become an expert at not feeling. He'd perfected a carefree persona, the guy who could turn anything into a joke, who never took anything seriously. It was safer that way, easier. His friends thought he'd bounced back remarkably well from the tragedy. They had no idea how much effort it took to maintain that illusion. But those notes May had played, they had found all the cracks in his armor, slipping through to touch the grief he'd buried so deeply he almost forgot it was there. Almost. The sliding door opened behind him, and he quickly straightened, wiping at his eyes. He expected one of his friends, coming to drag him back to the party. Instead, Professor Reynolds stepped onto the porch, 2 glasses in hand. "Thought you might need this," the professor said, offering one to Rich. Rich accepted it with a nod of thanks, taking a sip. The scotch burned pleasantly down his throat. "Some joke, huh?" Reynolds said mildly, leaning against the railing beside him. Rich winced. "Yeah, not my finest moment." "No," Reynolds agreed. "But sometimes our worst moments lead to unexpected discoveries." He glanced back toward the house where they could see May through the window, still sitting at the piano though no longer playing. "She wouldn't have played otherwise, I think." Rich nodded slowly. "Her music," he started, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "It gets inside you," Reynolds finished for him. "The best music always does." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their drinks. "You know," Reynolds said finally, "sometimes the things we mock are the very things we need the most." Rich looked at him sharply, but the professor was gazing out at the darkened garden, his expression thoughtful. After a moment, Reynolds patted him on the shoulder and headed back inside, leaving Rich alone with his thoughts. Inside, May was gathering her things, preparing to leave. The emotional toll of playing, especially that piece, had left her drained. As she slipped her cardigan on, she glanced out the window and saw Rich standing alone on the porch, his back to the part. Something in his posture, a certain tension of vulnerability, reminded her of herself. For a moment their eyes met through the glass. Neither smiled. Neither waved. But something passed between them, an understanding too complex for words. Then May turned away, said her goodbyes to Professor Reynolds, and slipped out into the night, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at her the same way again. May didn't sleep much that night. She lay awake in her small apartment, replaying the evening in her mind. The weight of so many eyes on her, the stunned silence that followed her performance, the tears she'd seen on several faces. It had been years since she'd played for anyone besides herself. and the rush of emotions left her feeling oddly vulnerable, as if she'd accidentally revealed too much. By morning, her phone was filled with notifications, friend requests from classmates who'd barely noticed her before, messages praising her talent, even a long email from Professor Reynolds expressing his hope that she would reconsider her decision to abandon performance. She ignored them all and made her usual cup of tea, watching the steam rise in the early morning light. Playing last night had been a moment of impulse, of pride perhaps. It didn't change anything. In 2 weeks she would graduate with her music appreciation degree and begin the internship at the Arts Foundation she'd already accepted, working behind the scenes, where she was comfortable. Her grandfather would have been disappointed. He'd never understood her retreat from performance. Music is meant to be shared, he would say. What use is light hidden under a blanket? But he hadn't been there when she froze during her conservatory audition, when the panic attack left her gasping for air in front of the judging panel. He hadn't seen how the pressure had slowly crushed her love for playing, until it felt more like a burden than a gift. He'd only seen her talent, not her fear. May sighed and gathered her books for class. She briefly considered skipping. The thought of facing everyone after last night made her stomach tighten, but she'd never missed a class in 4 years. She wouldn't start now just because she'd momentarily stepped out of her carefully maintained shadows. The campus was quiet at this hour, morning dew still clinging to the grass. May walked quickly, head down, hoping to reach the music building before the usual crowds arrived. She was almost there when a voice called out behind her. "Hey, piano girl, wait up!" She tensed, recognizing Rich's voice immediately. For a moment she considered pretending not to hear him, but that seemed childish. Instead she stopped and turned slowly. Rich jogged toward her, looking surprisingly disheveled. His usually perfect hair stuck up at odd angles and dark circles shadowed his eyes as if he'd slept as poorly as she had. He carried 2 coffee cups and held one out to her as he approached. I wasn't sure how you take it," he said, an uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice. "So I got it black. There's cream and sugar packets in my pocket if you want them." May stared at the offered cup, then at Rich, trying to understand what was happening. Was this some extension of last night's joke? "What do you want?" she asked quietly. Rich winced slightly at her tone. "Okay, I deserved that." He ran his free hand through his hair, making it stand up even more. "Look, I'm not great at this, but I'm sorry about last night. About putting you on the spot like that. It was a jerk move." May took the coffee slowly, still wary. "Why did you do it?" Rich's shoulders slumped a little. "Honestly, because I'm an idiot sometimes. I thought it would be funny to watch the quiet girl struggle through Mary Had a Little Lamb or something." He looked genuinely ashamed. "I didn't know you could play like that?" "Like what?" May asked, her voice still cool despite the small spark of curiosity his apology had kindled. Rich looked directly at her then, all traces of his usual cocky demeanor gone. "Like someone who knows exactly what it feels like when your heart breaks," he said simply. The unexpected honesty in his words caught her off guard. She looked away, unsure how to respond. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the campus slowly coming to life around them. "Why are you here, Rich?" she finally asked. "You've never spoken to me before last night, despite having 3 classes together over 4 years. 4, he corrected. We had Intro to Music Theory together freshman year too." She raised an eyebrow, surprised he remembered. Rich sighed. "I'm here because your music did something to me last night, and I can't stop thinking about it." He hesitated. "That second piece, the one you wrote. What's it called?" May took a sip of the coffee to buy herself time. It was good, rich and smooth. "It doesn't have a name yet," she admitted. "It's not finished. It's about someone, isn't it? Someone you lost." The directness of his question surprised her again. Most people would have danced around the subject, especially with someone they barely knew. But there was something in Rich's eyes, a rawness, a recognition that made her answer honestly. "My grandfather," she said. "He died 2 years ago. He's the one who taught me to play." Rich nodded slowly. "I thought so. It felt like a conversation with someone who isn't there anymore, like all the things you wish you could still say to them." May felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. That was exactly what the piece was. All her unspoken words, her gratitude, her regret at not living up to his expectations. How could Rich, of all people, understand that? "Anyway," Rich continued, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment, "I wanted to apologize. and to ask if you'd be willing to play that piece at the graduation ceremony next week." "What?" May nearly choked on her coffee. "The music department always features a student performer, and honestly, after hearing you play, it would be criminal to have anyone else. Professor Reynolds already suggested it, but I told him I'd ask you first since it's kinda my fault you got dragged into the spotlight in the first place." May shook her head quickly. "No, absolutely not. Why not? You're incredible, May. Everyone should hear you play." "I don't perform anymore," she said firmly. "Last night was an exception." Rich looked puzzled. "But you're a music major. How can you not perform?" "I'm a music appreciation major," she corrected. "There's a difference. But why?" "With your talent, I get panic attacks," she interrupted, immediately regretting the admission. She never discussed this with anyone. Why was she telling Rich of all people? To his credit, he didn't laugh or dismiss her fear. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. All that pressure, all those expectations. I can see how that would be overwhelming." His understanding caught her off guard again. "It is," she agreed quietly. They began walking toward the music building together, an unexpected companionship forming in the morning quiet. "Can I ask you something personal?" Rich said after a moment. May hesitated, then nodded. "When you're playing, like you were last night, do you still feel the panic?" The question was surprisingly insightful. May considered it carefully. "No," she admitted. "When I'm actually playing, especially something meaningful, everything else disappears. It's just me and the music." "That's what I thought," Rich said, a small smile touching his lips. "I could see it happening. The moment you forgot we were all there, you went somewhere else entirely." They reached the steps of the music building and stopped. Early morning sunlight streamed through the trees, casting dappled patterns on the stone. "Why is this so important to you?" May asked suddenly. "Why do you care if I play at graduation or not?" Rich looked away, his jaw tightening slightly. "I told you, your music. It did something to me. What did it do?" He was quiet for so long that May thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "It made me feel something real, for the first time since my dad died." The simple admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief. May remembered the way he'd stood alone on the porch after her performance, the unusual vulnerability in his posture. "I'm sorry about your father," she said softly. Rich shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "It was a year ago. Car accident. Everyone thinks I'm fine now." He gave a bitter laugh. "I've gotten really good at making sure they keep thinking that." May understood then. The constant jokes, the carefully maintained image of the carefree guy who never took anything seriously. It was armor, just as her silence had been hers. "Anyway," Rich continued, forcing his usual casual tone back into his voice. "Just think about the graduation performance, okay? No pressure." He gave her a small smile. "Though I should warn you, Reynolds is pretty determined. He might ambush you after class." "Thanks for the warning," May replied, finding herself returning his smile, if only slightly. As they entered the building, May felt the curious stares of other students. No doubt word of her performance had spread. She instinctively moved closer to Rich, using his confident presence as a shield. He noticed and, without comment, positioned himself between her and the most obvious onlookers. It was a small gesture, but a thoughtful one. "They'll get bored eventually," he murmured. "Trust me, I know how this place works. Next week there'll be some new drama for everyone to obsess over." "I hope you're right," she said. When they reached the classroom, Rich hesitated. "Will you be at Reynolds' review session on Thursday?" he asked. May nodded. "Maybe we could grab coffee before?" The question was casual, but there was an undercurrent of uncertainty in his voice that she'd never heard before. She found herself saying okay before she'd really thought about it. "Great," Rich said, looking genuinely pleased. "Same time, same place?" "Same time, same place," she agreed. As they entered the classroom together, May caught Professor Reynolds watching them with undisguised interest. She could practically see the wheels turning in the professor's head. Great, she thought. Just what she needed. More complications. But as she took her usual seat in the back corner, she realized something had shifted. The weight of other people's eyes on her didn't feel quite as heavy today. And when she glanced across the room at Rich, already surrounded by his usual friends but somehow looking slightly apart from them, she felt an unexpected connection. The recognition of someone else who understood what it meant to hide in plain sight. The coffee shop near campus was busier than usual on Thursday morning. End-of-semester stress had everyone seeking caffeine, and the line stretched nearly to the door. May arrived early, as was her habit for everything, and found a small table in the corner. She ordered a green tea and waited, wondering if Rich would actually show up. Part of her almost hoped he wouldn't. Their conversation 2 days ago had left her feeling oddly exposed, as if she'd revealed too much of herself to someone she barely knew. Yet another part of her was curious. The Rich she'd glimpsed beneath the joking exterior was so different from the one everyone else saw. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door swung open and Rich walked in, scanning the room. When he spotted her, a genuine smile spread across his face. Not the practiced charming one he usually wore, but something more hesitant and real. He waved and pointed to the counter, indicating he'd join her after ordering. May watched him in line, noticing how different he seemed in this context. At school, Rich was always surrounded by his crowd of friends and admirers, always the center of attention. Here alone, there was a quietness to him she hadn't noticed before, the way his shoulders relaxed slightly when no one was watching, the thoughtful expression as he scrolled through his phone. "Sorry about the wait," he said a few minutes later, sliding into the chair across from her with a large coffee. "End of semester madness." "It's fine," May replied, wrapping her hands around her mug. "I haven't been here long." An awkward silence fell between them. In the classroom 2 days ago, they'd managed a few casual exchanges before the professor arrived, but nothing substantial. Now sitting face to face with no distractions, the strange newness of their interaction was more apparent. "So," Rich finally said, "have you thought any more about playing at graduation?" May sighed. "Professor Reynolds caught me after class yesterday and spent 20 minutes trying to convince me." "And?" "And I told him no." Rich nodded slowly, not looking surprised. "Can I ask why? I mean, beyond the panic attacks, there must be something else keeping you from sharing your gift." May stared down at her tea. No one had ever asked her so directly before. Most people were too polite, too afraid of overstepping. "It's complicated," she said finally. "We've got time," Rich replied, settling back in his chair. "Review session doesn't start for an hour." She studied his face, looking for signs that this was just curiosity or, worse, some kind of game. But his expression was open, genuinely interested. After a moment, she decided to trust the instinct that told her he would understand. "When my grandfather brought me to America, it was because he believed I could become something special," she began. "He gave up everything, his home, his friends, his language, all for my music." That's a lot of pressure for a 12-year-old. Rich nodded, listening intently. "For years, I practiced 4 hours every day. Competitions, recitals, master classes. My whole life was about becoming the concert pianist my grandfather believed I could be." May traced the rim of her mug with her finger. "I never complained because I could see how much he'd sacrificed. How could I tell him that sometimes I hated it? That sometimes I just wanted to be normal? So what happened?" Rich asked softly. "I got accepted to the pre-college program at Juilliard when I was 16. It was everything we'd worked for. My grandfather was so proud." May smiled faintly at the memory. "But during my first major performance there, I just froze. Complete panic attack on stage. Couldn't breathe, couldn't move. They had to help me off." Rich winced sympathetically. "The doctors called it performance anxiety. Said it happens to a lot of musicians. But it wasn't just that. It was like all those years of pressure finally broke something in me." She shook her head. "I couldn't perform after that. Not without the panic returning. My grandfather was so confused. He kept saying, 'But you love music,' and I did. I just couldn't bear the weight of his expectations anymore." "That must have been really hard for both of you," Rich said quietly. May nodded. "He never said he was disappointed, but I could see it. When I chose to study music appreciation instead of performance, he tried to understand, but—" She paused, feeling the familiar ache of regret. "He died still believing I would eventually go back to performing. That I just needed time. And that's why you won't play at graduation? Because it would mean he was right?" May looked up sharply. The question cut closer to the truth than she'd expected. "Maybe," she admitted. "Or maybe because if I did play and failed again, it would be like letting him down all over again." Rich was quiet for a moment, considering. "What if you're letting him down by not trying?" he asked gently. From what you've told me, it sounds like he believed in you more than you believed in yourself. That's part of the problem, May said. I don't know where his dreams for me ended and mine began. Rich nodded, understanding in his eyes. I get that more than you might think. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. My dad was the baseball star at our school back in the day. Had scouts looking at him and everything before he blew out his knee. So of course I had to play too. Did you hate it? May asked. No, that's the thing. I loved it, still do. But sometimes I wonder if I would have chosen it on my own, if it wasn't already decided for me before I was even born. He shrugged. When he died last year, I almost quit the team. It felt pointless without him there to watch. But you didn't quit, May observed. No, I didn't. Because I realized I wasn't just playing for him. I was playing for me, too. He leaned forward slightly. Maybe it's the same with your music, May. Maybe part of it was for your grandfather, but part of it was always for you. The part that still plays when no one's watching. His words resonated uncomfortably. May had spent so long separating herself from performance that she'd almost convinced herself she only played to honor her grandfather's memory. But that wasn't entirely true. The piano had been her voice long before it became her burden. I don't know if I can do it, she said finally. I don't know if I'm ready. What if you didn't think of it as a performance? Rich suggested. What if it was just sharing something that matters to you, like you did the other night? That was different. I was angry at you, she said, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. I wasn't thinking about the audience, Rich laughed. Well, maybe you need to be angry more often. You play beautifully when you're mad. For the first time in their conversation, May smiled fully. I'll keep that in mind. As they walked to campus for the review session, their conversation shifted to lighter topics, favorite composers, worst music theory assignments, Professor Reynolds' habit of humming during exams. It felt strangely easy talking to Rich, as if they'd known each other far longer than they actually had. When they reached the music building, Rich paused. Listen, some of us are getting together tonight at the courtyard to blow off steam before finals week. Nothing fancy, just hanging out. He hesitated. You should come. The invitation surprised her. The courtyard was a popular campus cafe where Rich and his crowd usually held court. She'd walked past it many times but never gone inside. It wasn't her scene. I don't think so, she said automatically. Come on, just for a little while. When she still looked hesitant, he added, I promise no one will ask you to play the piano. There isn't even one there. May couldn't help but smile at that. I'll think about it. 8 o'clock, he said. And May? About graduation, no pressure, but the offer stands. I think your grandfather would be proud, whatever you decide. As Rich headed into the building, May remained outside for a moment, thinking about their conversation. For so long she'd kept her thoughts about her grandfather and her music private, locked away where they couldn't hurt her. Sharing them with Rich had been unexpectedly freeing. Maybe he was right. Maybe she had been hiding from more than just the panic attacks. Maybe she'd been hiding from the possibility that her grandfather had been right all along, that her music was meant to be shared. The review session passed in a blur of practice questions and study tips. May found herself glancing across the room at Rich several times, still trying to reconcile the thoughtful person from the coffee shop with the class clown everyone else saw. Once he caught her looking and gave her a small, private smile that made her quickly turn away, feeling oddly flustered. After class, Professor Reynolds asked her to stay behind. Here it comes, she thought. Another plea to reconsider the graduation performance. But instead, he simply handed her a folder. I found this in the department archives, he said. I thought you might find it interesting. May opened it curiously. Inside was a program from a piano competition held 15 years earlier. She scanned the list of performers, her breath catching when she spotted a familiar name. My grandfather, she whispered, running her finger over the printed characters. Reynolds nodded. He was quite accomplished before he left China. Not many people knew that. How did you know? May asked, looking up at him in surprise. When you played the other night, there was something familiar about your technique. I couldn't place it until I remembered judging a competition years ago, where a man with the same last name performed. His hands moved just like yours. The professor smiled gently. He was very good. But if he could hear you play now, I think he would realize you've surpassed him. May felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you for showing me this. Your grandfather understood something essential about music, May. It's not just about technical skill or performance. It's about communication, speaking to others in a language deeper than words. Reynolds placed his hand on her shoulder briefly. Just something to think about. As May walked back to her apartment that afternoon, her mind was full of conflicting thoughts. The program from her grandfather's competition felt like a message from the past, a reminder of where she came from and what music had meant to her family for generations. She spent hours at her small keyboard, playing softly so as not to disturb her neighbors. The piece for her grandfather was evolving, changing as her understanding of him and herself continued to shift. It wasn't about grief anymore, or at least not just about grief. It was about connection, about the conversation they'd never finished. At 7:45, she made an impulsive decision. She changed into a simple blue dress, ran a brush through her hair, and headed toward the courtyard. She wasn't sure what drew her there, curiosity perhaps, or the strange comfort she'd found in talking with Rich earlier, or maybe it was simply time to step out of the shadows she'd hidden in for so long. The courtyard buzzed with energy when May arrived. String lights twinkled overhead, and small groups of students clustered around tables, the air filled with laughter and conversation. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly questioning her decision to come. This was Rich's world, not hers. Maybe she should just go home. Before she could turn away, a familiar voice called her name. She looked up to see Rich waving from a table in the corner. His face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure at the sight of her, and something about that honest reaction gave her the courage to walk over. "You came," he said as she approached, quickly pulling out a chair for her. "I honestly didn't think you would." "Neither did I," May admitted, feeling self-conscious as the others at the table turned to look at her. Rich quickly made introductions. "Everyone, this is May. May, this is everyone." He gestured around the table at his friends, most of whom May recognized from classes but had never spoken to. "You're the piano girl," said one guy, a baseball teammate of Rich's, based on his varsity jacket. "Rich hasn't stopped talking about your playing since the party." Rich shot his friend a warning look. "I mentioned it once or twice." "Try a dozen times," another friend laughed. "Never seen this guy so impressed by anything that doesn't involve a baseball." May felt her face grow warm, but the teasing was good-natured. No one seemed to find it strange that she was there, and gradually she began to relax. The conversation flowed easily around her. Talk of finals, summer plans, funny stories about professors. She mostly listened, occasionally offering a comment when the topic shifted to music. "So, May?" asked a girl with brightly colored hair who'd been introduced as Rich's lab partner. "Are you playing at graduation? The music department always has someone perform." May darted a glance at Rich, who looked apologetic. "I didn't say anything," he assured her. "It's just common knowledge about the music department tradition. I'm still thinking about it," May said carefully. "Well, after what I heard about your playing at Reynolds's party, you should definitely do it," the girl continued enthusiastically. "Everyone's talking about it." The conversation moved on before May had to respond, much to her relief. Throughout the evening, she found herself watching Rich. In this setting, surrounded by friends, he was much like the Rich she'd always observed from a distance. Confident, funny, the center of attention. But now she caught glimpses of that other Rich too, in the way his smile sometimes didn't quite reach his eyes, in the momentary shadows that crossed his face when certain topics came up. Once, when someone mentioned parents coming for graduation, she saw him tense almost imperceptibly before deflecting with a joke. No one else seemed to notice, but May did, because she was looking for it now, because she recognized it. As the night wore on, people gradually drifted away until only May, Rich, and a couple of others remained. When his last friend left to catch up with someone across the cafe, Rich turned to May with a more relaxed smile. "Thanks for coming," he said. "I know this isn't really your scene." "It's not so bad," she replied, surprising herself with the admission. "Your friends are nice." "They can be," he agreed with a laugh, "when they're not being complete idiots." They fell into an easy conversation, picking up almost where they'd left off that morning. There was something freeing about talking in this dimly lit corner, surrounded by the gentle hum of other people's lives, but somehow separate from them. Rich told her more about his father, his booming laugh, his endless patience with baseball practice, his collection of terrible ties that Rich had inherited but never worn. May shared stories about her grandfather, his meticulous care of the old piano, his habit of humming classical pieces while cooking, his fierce pride in her accomplishments. "Have you been back to the piano since the party?" Rich asked after a comfortable lull. May nodded. "Every day." "And the piece for your grandfather? Is it finished?" She thought about the new ending she'd composed just that afternoon, hopeful and resolute rather than melancholy. "Almost." Rich seemed to hesitate before speaking again. "I know I promised not to pressure you about graduation, but I have something to show you first." He pulled out his phone and navigated to a video. "Professor Reynolds shared this with me. It's from the night of the party. Someone recorded part of your performance." May stiffened. "I don't want to see that." "Just watch for a second," Rich urged gently. "Not you, the audience." Reluctantly, May leaned over to view the screen. The video quality wasn't great, but she could make out herself at the piano, lost in the music. Then the camera panned to show the audience. What she saw made her breath catch. Every face was transformed. Professor Reynolds had tears streaming down his cheeks. A girl May barely knew was clutching her hand to her heart. And Rich, the camera lingered on him for a moment, stood completely still. His carefully constructed facade stripped away, raw emotion written across his features. "That's what your music does." "May," Rich said quietly as the video ended. "It's like—" For a few minutes, everyone in that room was honest. Really honest, maybe for the first time in a long time. He put his phone away. "I just thought you should see that." May sat in silence, processing what she'd just watched. She'd been so caught up in her own fear that night that she hadn't fully registered the impact of her playing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," she finally replied, "about not knowing where your grandfather's dreams ended and yours began." She traced a pattern on the table with her finger. "Maybe they're not as separate as I thought. Maybe honoring his belief in me means finding my own way to share music, not necessarily following the path he imagined." Rich nodded, understanding in his eyes. "So what does that mean for graduation?" May took a deep breath. "It means I'm still terrified, but I think I want to try." Graduation day dawned clear and bright. The university quad was transformed with rows of chairs facing the stage, where soon hundreds of students would receive their diplomas. Behind the stage, in a small tent serving as a preparation area, May sat alone at a portable keyboard, running through scales to warm up her fingers. The panic was there, lurking at the edges of her mind, but somehow more distant than before. In the 2 weeks since her conversation with Rich at the courtyard, she'd practiced her grandfather's piece every day, refining it, perfecting it. She'd also spent time with Rich and his friends, gradually stepping out of the shadows she'd hidden in for so long. A rustle at the tent entrance made her look up. Rich ducked inside, dressed in his graduation gown with his cap slightly askew. "You're not supposed to be back here," May said, though she couldn't help smiling at the sight of him. "Since when do I follow the rules?" he replied with a grin, crossing to sit beside her. "How are you feeling?" "Terrified," she admitted. "But, okay, somehow. You're going to be amazing." His confidence in her was unwavering. "Just remember what you told me. When you're playing, everything else disappears. It's just you and the music." May nodded, taking a deep breath. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for pushing me to do this. For seeing something in me that I'd forgotten was there. You're thanking me for being a jerk at a party?" Rich